Rabbit hole sounds a little bit strange actually when I hear it back now. So imagine, if you will, you're on the Magento 2 journey. You hit a tricky problem, complex problem. What do? We'll fix it, right? But how do we do this without losing too much time and getting stuck down the rabbit hole? My name's Tony, I'm from Space 48. I've worked with Magento since version 1.2, and I do some crazy events like Tough Mudder. So, okay, a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the change from Magento 1 to Magento 2 from a developer's point of view. And specifically, I want to talk about a debugging technique that I've recently adopted. And to enforce that, I'm going to, in the main, go through a problem-solving exercise that I recently went through, highlighting how this debugging technique helped me to reduce wasting time. So, Magento 1 to Magento 2. It's been a while coming. It was worth the wait, in my opinion. But obviously, that time, they've been busy, and it is quite a big change. Architecturally, there's a lot under the hood that has changed that's hopefully going to make our lives easier, particularly with respect to writing tests. You know, Vinay's talk earlier on, mentioning dependency injection, how it's really brought Magento forward with more modern technologies and techniques and best practices should make our lives easier. We've just got to invest that time in getting up the Magento 2 curve. One of the big main things they've been doing during this exercise is to try and decouple the code to make it more isolated so that it's easier to enable and disable aspects of the code without having too much impact, and generally to be able to write cleaner code and cleaner architecture. Moreover, this also should mean, because it's more component friendly and we've got Composer, then we should be able to reuse other well-established components that exist out there in the community. One of the big key bits, and Dan earlier on talking about plugins, there are mechanisms there that should make the modifications and customizations to the system much more targeted. And that, covered with the fact that there is test coverage in the system and the fact that we should have our own test coverage, should mean that the whole upgrade process is a smoother process. Magento are committed to regular releases, so this should really help with that. But what does this actually mean, you know, all these big changes that have been brought into the system? Well, it kind of reminds me of the back in the day when I was trying to learn Magento 1. You know, it's like, where have all these files come from? How does this fit with this? You know, it is going to be a learning curve that we've got to invest time in getting up. However, the Magento community, I believe, is much stronger now. There's so much more resources than there were back in the day with Magento 1. So this journey should be easier, but be prepared. You know, there's a challenge ahead. So the technique that I mentioned earlier, I just want to cover that. I have done a previous speech, a talk at Mage Titans in Manchester about debugging in Magento in general, that went through particular tools that are available and some general strategies. But today I really just want to talk about one thing, and that is just trying to reduce this time running away from you, which is trying to step back from the code when you're getting into this debugging cycle. And there's something called the Pomodoro technique, which I know is an Italian word, and I'm probably pronouncing that not so great, but this technique revolves around setting a specific time frame, which the suggestion is 25 minutes, at which point there's an alarm that goes off, and at that point you would stop and take a break. Now, the Pomodoro technique is actually more to promote a workflow and a working strategy, but the way I'm actually applying it is just specifically to a debugging scenario. So I'm not actually doing this as part of my day-to-day, it's just when I get into this workflow trying to solve a problem, I will set the timer, start working along, and then when the timer goes off, I'll stop. and just reanalyze where I've got to, whether I believe I am going in the right direction or whether I need to go in a different way. So just a little bit on the development environment that I use locally. We've restructured this now for working with Magento 2. We work with virtual machines that are provisioned via Vagrant, and we try to install all the softwares that we would have in a production environment to try and get as close to what we would have in a live environment, so that we reduce the chances of having production problems that weren't apparent on a local environment. We don't go to extremes with this, but as you can see, the components and softwares that I have installed in this VM is Nginx, running PHP 7, with Xdebug to help with debugging, the database, and particularly with Magento 2 now introducing the full page cache being powered by Varnish, I want to have that locally, again, so that I can get proper feedback as to whether there are any issues locally. Even having SSL locally as well. So I'll go into how Varnish actually got that configured locally. One of the things with Varnish is that it doesn't inherently support SSL, not the free version anyway. The diagram on the left here highlights how you would configure Varnish just running over HTTP. It's a service that sits in front of your web server, listening for the requests coming in over port 80. If there's a cached version of that page, it'll return it. If not, it requests it from the back end, the web server, and then it gets back to Varnish, stored or not, depending on what Magento says. And this Varnish is very, very fast. That's why it's good, a good implementation for caching. The complexity comes in with trying to run it with HTTPS. To get around this, one approach is to have something called a Varnish sandwich, which is to have Nginx in front as a proxy to handle the SSL certificate. So that would be listening on port 443. That'll be handling the request, but pass it on to Varnish over 80 and carry on as the left side. So you get that benefit, and that's how I had this set up in the local environment. So I'm going to go on to this example now and how I use this Pomodoro technique. Should be hopefully familiar with this. This is just the out-of-the-box standard theme in Magento 2. And I had it looking like this for a minute until I enabled the SSL on the local environment, and then it changed to this. So the keen eyes in the audience should be able to see there's a difference. So where has my menu gone? So in summary, the problem was the combination of having Varnish configured to run as the full page cache and having the key bit here is having SSL on the front end. So it was there and not just there for the admin or the checkout, but for the complete front end, because we've got that as a requirement for a project that we're working on, is that the navigation disappeared. So I'm going to go through now explaining how I tried to solve this. So the first step is, has anyone had this problem before, right? Don't try and resolve a problem solved by someone else. Stack Exchange, unfortunately, I did find someone on there asking the question, but there were no answers. Marius mustn't have got there yet, or so. One of the other guys.
How is that my fault?
So I was on my own, unfortunately. I was spending time researching, looking out there, but couldn't really turn out any answers. So then I turned to more research and trying to understand how Varnish is working with Magento 2 and how it's put together. I found a very good Alan Kent article, which is an old article, but gave information about how it all works together. The dev docs have been mentioned today. You know, as I said, Magento 2 is in a much better place now. The documentation is very good. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything that gave me an exact answer there, but again, it helped my understanding. And then there were some other blog posts, not many, but one particular good one from Alan Storm that highlighted where the code was in Magento 2 that dealt with the full page cache, which did help me later on. But then my 25 minutes were up. So I stopped and I was like, okay, I've surfed the web for long enough now. I need to actually get into the code. There's no answers out there. I need to actually try and solve this one myself. But just to summarize what I did learn up to this point, was that Varnish is, as we saw before, sat in front of the web server. And the pages are cached on a URL basis. So the request is coming in and it's holding, if Magento decides, the page to be cached. One of the main challenges that comes in with using Varnish there is how it handles private data, unique data to a visitor. So it's very good at having pages that are unique to everybody, common to everybody, but when it needs to be unique, such as when you're adding something to the basket, there needs to be a way for it to handle it rather than it just not caching everything. There are a couple of approaches to do this. One of the common ones is to use edge-side includes, ESI, but Magento haven't taken that direction. They've taken the direction of Ajax. The downside with using edge-side includes, well, I'll explain what those are, edge-side includes. The content that is stored by Varnish, it can have an edge-side include, an include in the content of the page. And when Varnish is processing that, it'll find the include and it will have a secondary request to pull in that content, and it all happens in Varnish. So you could have the basket area as an include that will then pull that content in from somewhere else. But if you've got many of those in the page, then that's multiple requests that are all happening to pull in this private data. And it's going to make a full request of Magento with layout and everything to pull that thing in. So the approach they actually used was to instead use Ajax. So what happens is the page comes back and then the client side, Ajax kicks in to make one request, and that request only returns JSON. So it's just some data, purely data, that can then be plugged into the various areas on the page, which is much more efficient. Also, that can be stored in the browser cache. So unless you do another post request or something that would require that to be invalidated, your browser's just going to store that request, and everything's still just coming from Varnish. So their approach to use Ajax looks pretty good. They do, however, still use edge-side includes, but this is just to give them finer control over an area of the content, a certain block, so that they can have a different TTL, or so that that block can be invalidated on its own, rather than having to invalidate the whole page. So back to trying to solve the problem. So the next step was looking for errors. You know, is there anything obviously wrong? Have I configured something wrong? What's going on? There were no errors in the Magento log. There was nothing in the console, so it didn't look like it was any kind of JavaScript problem. So I just actually looked at the HTML output. The menu doesn't appear to be there, but is it really not there? It's really not there. We can see the div here was it's an empty div where the menu is supposed to be when I was looking at it over HTTPS. But over HTTP, we see a different story. We've got the div there with all the menu content. So what to look at next? So I thought, well, I'll look at the page headers. When you're running with Varnish, if you look at the request headers for the page, you can see, you get more information about what Varnish has actually done. And if you look at the Magento to Varnish configuration file, the VCL file, you can see some logic that they've got in there to do with this X Magento debug. Now, if this flag is true, it's going to give us more information about the request that's being made, whether it was a hit or a miss, meaning was it cached by Varnish or not, or did it come from Varnish, and even the age. And what makes this work is whether you're running in developer mode. That's where that flag comes from. So if you were trying to debug a Varnish issue on a staging site that you've got running in production mode, then you won't get this additional information unless you override this VCL. I also, while I was doing this on my local, commented out this X Magento tags header because it was being unset, and I wanted to see that. And what that is when we look at the headers that were being returned, we see the 3 that I've mentioned there, that it was returning as a cache hit at this point. I'd visited it a couple of times, the age of that resource, but we can see the Magento tags that have been associated with this cached page, and that is there to help with targeted invalidation of the pages, to clear out those cached pages. We want to minimize, we only want to flush out the pages that the minimum that we need to when we're saving or something happens in the system, and that's what makes that possible. So all this information was great, but did it help me? I spent another 25 minutes, not really helped. So I needed to start looking actually at that block that was missing. And this looks very familiar, I would hope, to Magento 1. Some slight differences, but the thing that stuck out to me was this TTL. Like, where's that come from? What effect does that have? So my instinct was, well, let's take it out. Let's see what happens. And I did take it out, and the page actually rendered correctly. The menu was back, but that didn't feel like a fix to me. You know, that's there for a reason. I want to understand really what's going on. So the next step was to actually go line by line through the code using Xdebug. And because of the research earlier from Alan Storm, I knew where the code actually was. It uses a plugin around the front controller. So I stepped through the code to the point at the end of that plugin. It was an around plugin. Just to look at, I can see the state of the application at that point in time, and I could look at the layout object and see what was in there, what blocks were in the layout object, because I wanted to know, at this point, is the menu block still in there? And it was still in there at that point. So I carried on stepping through until I got right back to quite a high level, which is at Bootstrap, just the point before it sends the content, the response, back to what would normally be the browser, but in this case it's going back to Varnish, then us. And I could see the content as it's being all put together in one variable in the response object. And when I put that into something I could read, I could actually see it wasn't under HTTPS that the div was empty. It was including an edge side include. And this edge side include has a specific URL, a controller that it's hitting in Magento to pull in the block. Over HTTP, the only difference was that it was doing it over HTTP. This kind of makes sense. You know, we're running over HTTP, but the edge side include request, that's the only difference, is the protocol. Now, I would say, I didn't put this in the slides, but I did get rid of the TTL to see what effect that would have. And when I looked at the content in that circumstance, the edge side include disappeared and the content was just there. So the TTL is basically switching it to use an edge side include. Kind of makes sense in that is going to be independently cached. That's the intention. The TTL is there to say, well, I want this block to expire in a different time compared to the page. 25 minutes gone again. Now, I feel all right at this point. I feel like I'm getting somewhere, so I'm just going to carry on. So I know, what do I know from that? I know that Varnish is getting the block or the instructions to get the block returned to it. So what I want to know is this controller that I've seen in the edge side includes, what does it actually look like? I'm going to visit it. And you get the menu. It doesn't look great, but that's because none of the styling applies or anything. But when I visited that directly over HTTP or HTTPS, it worked. I kind of thought over HTTPS it wouldn't render, but it did. So then I'm thinking, okay, well that works in isolation, it must be Varnish that can't hit it over HTTPS. So I'm going to step through the code in this controller, see what's happening. Unfortunately, this wouldn't work, because with Xdebug, ordinarily it's me that's making the request and I can hook into the runtime, but because it was Varnish that was then making the request, I couldn't hook into it, or at least I tried and couldn't manage it. So I reverted back to another technique, which is just to throw some login information into the file, which with Magento 2 is a little bit more convoluted to set up. Originally, you have to get the logger interface included in the constructor, but I was then able to just log out howdy to know if that controller was being called. Sorry. And what I found was, over HTTP, it was getting logged out, but over HTTPS, it wasn't. So now I know Varnish just isn't even trying to pull in that edge side include. The question is why? So I started looking for Varnish logs then, and there's an aptly named application called Varnish Log, which spits out all kinds of information. One tip would be that to minimize the information and be a little bit more focused on the right information, when you normally just refresh a page, you're going to get data in here for all the assets that have been requested. So all the JS, the CSS, everything that's happened. So to get rid of all that, I just did a view page source, and that meant only the page was being requested. And what I saw then when I looked into it, there was this kind of says what's going on. It was saying edge side include XML error with HTTPS ignored. I didn't really know what that was, so I'm going to search for it. And I found an old Varnish ticket that basically spelt it out again, with saying by default, edge side includes won't be processed over HTTPS. But they have a nice setting that you can change that will basically treat it as HTTP instead. So I looked how to achieve that. This is part of the Varnish service initialization script, and I've added in there this setting, and the menu was back. So what did I learn from that exercise? I mean, Magento 2 is tricky, but if you do take regular breaks, I really do believe that it can help you to reduce wasted effort and time. And also, I think the full page cache implementation they've given us is pretty cool. Thank you very much.
Question here.
Hi, my name is Ivan. The question to you is, actually I have two questions. First one is about HTTPS or Varnish itself.
Yeah.
Did you ever try Varnish Hish project? It's open source Varnish proxy for HTTPS encryption.
No. I did look and I saw that there was a paid for Varnish service that did support SSL, but I wasn't aware of any other.
If you go to GitHub Varnish, you
Okay.
will find out there was a Hish project, and you can set up it as a lightweight HTTPS
Okay.
proxy for
Cool.
Varnish.
Good to know.
It's working. And another thing about ESI itself, I think it's a bug in Magento itself, because it's better to put only relative URL without hostname and protocol.
Of course, yeah.
In ESI tools, and the rest of the headers that are set to the main page are also set to ESI.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I did look to see on GitHub if there were any existing issues there, and I am going to follow up on that. So, thank you. Anything else?
You said you found a question on Stack Exchange that had no answer. Did you answer it?
Yes, I did.